Likis, and welcome to Book 101. Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is a novelist exploring transformation in the near future and the author of several books, none other than Mr. Douglas Cole.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. It's good to be on your show.
Yes, once again, Mr. Douglas, can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Sure. Well, I'm up here in Seattle, Washington, and I teach as well as write and enjoy my life up here. Got the new book out called The Invisible Hand, and I just read last night at Elliott Bay Books here in Seattle, which is a small accomplishment for me to read at Elliott Bay, as I've always wanted to read there. And I've got some other books out if people are interested in what they hear, poetry and another novel. And I also do poetry spoken pieces uh, accompanied by music for an online journal called Jerry Jazz Musician. And those are a lot of fun to do. I think people enjoy those too. They're somewhat centered around the genre of jazz music and musicians, but they wide range in landscapes and concerns and characters. So it's entertaining to a general population, not just a jazz aficionado.
Yes, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Douglas. Thank you, thank you. And today let's talk about yet the writing process of all your books.
Sure.
Would you describe your writing process as a more of a discipline, architectural blueprint, or intuitive archaeological?
Oh, that's a nice way of putting those. Always all of the above. I mean,
All of the
discipline
above.
in the sense, yeah, well, discipline in the sense that, like with any art or craft, or activity, the more you do it, the better you supposedly get, or hopefully
Yes.
do. I'm always hoping to get better and learn more and expand and change and grow and flow. And that means being, involved in it, thinking. The question makes me think of something I heard Gary Snyder, the poet, say once. He said he did a lot of his composing of his poetry while he was walking, and the rhythms of walking kind of helped him sort of compose in a rhythmic way, or locate certain languages in ways that coincided with the rhythms of his walking. And he would often have a whole thing composed in his mind, ready to be written down through that kind of a process. And I've always liked that idea. And it's, of course, a very Zen idea that, in any moment you can be occupied in meditation. Any anything can be turned into a form of meditation, which is a form of discipline, which is a form of creation too. Um, but there's also, yeah, and within that too, and it's sometimes it's the very, I think it's the tactile. It's kind of like the person who likes to work with clay. The fun part of, especially a bigger book like a novel like The Invisible Hand, is the architecture, like you said, of putting pieces together and moving them around, being very kind of targeted and conscious in your decisions, or my decisions, I should say. But ultimately, that other element you indicated too, that sort of inspiration, quiet sort of surrender of the mind, and that's always a part of it too, which I find to be, well, it makes me think there's sort of these three stages I found myself aware of when working on The Invisible Hand. And the first is just that total immersion, creation, and anything can happen and anything is given, and it's a very free and creative space. And then there's a sort of a second editorial wave where you have to come back and look at it and sort of put your crap detector on, and weed out what doesn't work and smooth out things. And I think of Toni Morrison, a beautiful American writer, said that she liked to revise so that it looked like she never did. And I think that's a beautiful way to think about it, so that it looks completely natural. And that editorial mind has to be kind of conscious, awake, and sort of standing out and sort of making, choices. And and another element that you didn't mention that I'd like to add is what I've discovered in trying to present the book to the world and read from it and talk about it with people like yourself and reading at a bookstore is a way of seeing it now that I employ more as a teacher and a student, because there are ways in which, of course, when you're just creative and allowing that things are happening without your total conscious awareness, and then take a few steps down time's alleyway and you can change the perspective. I do, and I can start to read it a little bit more as I would read another person's work and start to see some of the things that are working in there that I wasn't even kind of aware I was doing. And that's a lot of fun. That's been a lot of fun in this way. I mean, I don't really want to study it, but but there is a high level of kind of conscious construction, but there always remains a nice, strong sidecar of completely intuitive and creative eruptions that I've discovered along the way. And I kind of thank myself for allowing a lot of things to happen because they ended up being what seemed like pretty good choices. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, Mr. Douglas. So, do you have a non negotiable pre writing ritual that transitions you from the everyday world into a creative headspace of your work in progress?
Mm. Well, I think it's kind of the pleasure of my work and where I am now is that I can devote time to it every day, and I have my I'm like I've got a to-do list. I've got a to-do list of things to work on, and I got things that are I'm looking at and I want to dream them bigger, and I've got other things I'm realizing I just want to abandon them. So yeah, the discipline part, a kind of you know I like a certain amount of routine because it gives me regular spaces with which to work, but I also like to kind of completely blow it up and get out of my spaces too. So that it's really a movable feast, as Hemingway said. you know, you take it with you wherever you go.
Yes, definitely. Take it out wherever you go. How has your co-writing process evolved from your first book to your most recent? What is one thing you've steadfastly kept and one thing you have deliberately discarded?
Sitting at the computer for too many hours, it was really bad on my back. I found out you got to really stand up and exercise. You got to, I seriously, this may sound kind of flippant, but it's not that, began to realize you've got to approach whatever you're doing, art, I do, more like a, forgive the analogy, a samurai, where everything goes into it. You know, the way you treat your body, the way you treat your relationships become part of the process of the writing too, if that makes sense, because you are creating. I was thinking about this too today. It's what you're doing. It's what I'm doing. What I'm trying to tell my kids to do in terms of having some kind of a creative activity is to make your life a work of art. And I know that sounds kind of highfalutin and romantic and kind of pretentious, but I mean, that's what I think is beautiful about engaging in that creative act is that it does offer this opportunity to sort of engage in the world in a slightly more creative way. I think of James Joyce, a beautiful writer and poet, who said that his practice was really a form of trying to convert the bread of common day into the holy host, the sacrament of art. I think that's a way I've thought beautifully way to
Yes.
think about it.
Beautifully articulated, Mr. Douglas. So, where do you typically write on how essential is that specific
Um,
physical environment and ambience to tapping into your creative flow?
I've had the um, I've had the fortune to have two spaces that really one space that two that I carved out as kind of an office space, little room space, and I had a nice plywood piece of wood that I stained and put on top of two little file cabinets, and that was great. And I could have books around. And then we moved, and I had a little space, and I created that. And then for a while, I had no particular designated space, and so it was more just at kitchen counters and propped up in bed or wherever in the living room, but wherever, not necessarily always in the same space. Right now, I've kind of hijacked my younger son's bedroom. 'Cause he's moved out for a couple of years now. I still think of it as his room though, but I've begun moving my books in here, and I've begun to use the desk space for these kinds of conversations and working too. So I've kind of creeped back into having a stable space, but there's a little part of me, I think, that's always felt like you don't want to get too comfortable. I don't want to, you know, get a little too scholarly about it. I like, you know, the Basho approach, the notebook, blue road to the interior way of thinking about writing. Just throw your script into the bag as you go, and then wherever you camp, you take them out and read.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And Mr. Douglas, are you a
Mhm.
dedicated outliner or a discovery writer? If you outline, how detailed does it get, and how often does the story rebel against the plan?
Mm. Uh, Sometimes I don't really outline that much, to be honest, until I get more into an editorial stage, and then I outline to organize what's already there. But I like to kind of just move forward in the mist of the create, whatever it is. Although, as I mentioned when we spoke on Wednesday, when I was working on The White Field, my first book, the whole story was clear in my mind before I even started because I was thinking about it when I was going to school up at Western Washington University in Bellingham, and I was still living in Seattle. So I was commuting up there, and I'd stay overnight a couple nights a week. And I was driving back and forth and driving back and forth, and I just started to dream this story of a convict getting out of prison, trying to make his life again, and at some point, for whatever reason, he's on the run, and the landscape I was in was the target, because up in the north part of Washington, outside the I-5 corridor, the highway, there's still a lot of forest. There's still a lot of, you know, a lot of it is national forest, the Cascades, and then, of course, over on the peninsula, we have the Olympics. And I had this image of escape, and it was just very strong. And I knew the 2 points that the story was going, and so along the way, it was just kind of a walking meditation to get to that moment of flight. And so there was never an outline to it. With this new book, The Invisible Hand, because it's got this more complicated network of narratives, this weaving of narratives, at a certain point, I sort of physically did an outlining where I took sections and I kind of just placed them physically in the room and began to move them around and more molding and shaping, as much as like pre-crafting through anything I sketched out on paper. And I kind of like that process. The poetry works that way for the most part. Those are smaller pieces usually, even though I have some longer poems in some of the books. But even those usually, they don't necessarily come out written just from beginning to end. They might come out in sections here and there and kind of grow together. But yeah, I don't do too much kind of tactful, positioning on a paper to outline until, like I said, I might get further into the refining. And like with The Invisible Hand, as we were working on the edits, when I was working with the editor, um, there were times where I began to outline it in order to clarify for myself, how does this look next to this? What is the trajectory in this first part, second part, third part, and the three parts within? So it's a little more intuitive, but I again, kind of like Gary Snyder, a lot of times I think I'm just kind of doing the work in my head, and then when I get the space, I come in and work on it in the real world.
In the real world, indeed, Mr. Douglas. So, what does productive writing day or session look like for you in terms of word count, hours, or measurable progress? Do you aim for a daily minimum?
Oh, oh, that's a good question. Um, no, no, I never have like a word count, man, except when like when I'm editing, like for example, with The Invisible Hand, when I was trying to get it into a state to send out for publication, I did have targeted numbers of maybe pages. I was like, each day I want to get at least 5 pages through, edit 5 pages. And, I'd get up at 5 in the morning and I'd do my work for a couple hours before I'd go to work and use those as my clean brain time and shoot for, yes, exactly like you said, about a certain amount, not usually not amount of words. Sometimes it would toggle back and forth, in my brain. I'd be thinking, hey, you hit, 2,500 words yesterday. See if you can do it again today. So those became targets. So more in the editing process, the revision process, I set myself targets. Um, I think because I feel like it's a little more realistic for me because it's already there, and so I'm kind of moving through and refining. But I always, always allow myself, if I hit a spot that's maybe problematic, I let myself spend time on it, and I'm not too rigid about those numbers.
Indeed, not too rigid, relax, and just write, write, write. Do you listen
Yeah.
to music or require silence while writing, Mr. Douglas? If music, how do
Mm.
you curate playlists for different projects or moods?
That's an interesting question. Thanks, Daniel. I like thinking about that. Because usually when I'm writing or editing, I don't have music on. I like to stay pretty focused. Um, except for these pieces I've been doing with the Jerry Jazz Musician Journal. And a lot of those I actually use the music to compose. In fact, one thing I've been experimenting with and realizing in the process is at first I would use some piece of music, maybe something from. I began with like a piece from Chet Baker, um, Nightbird, and actually that was one of the first things I published with Jerry Jazz, and it's a piece that was in my first novel too, The White Field, and kind of composed it listening to a particular song, and so the song was kind of the landscape I was describing mentally. In fact, if you give me a moment, I can tell you that there's a book, my poetry book, The Blue Island, has a section in it that is entirely composed using Miles Davis's album, Ascenseur pour l'échafaud. I could be pronouncing that incorrectly. Ascent to the Gallows, Elevator to the Gallows. And what I did was I listened to the music of it and just composed whatever was in the landscape of my imagination and mind from the music, and used the music as a kind of a rhythmic marker, timer, along the lines of Gary Snyder's walking rhythm. And so what I did is I composed a sequence of poems based on the music, and the music itself was based on Miles Davis watching a movie. And so he used the movie to create the music. And so I was curious how much the music that he created translated that movie into what I created in the inspiration of just the music. And there were certain interesting connections because I'd never seen the film. It's a Louis Malle film. And so that always remained in the back of my head. And so I keep sort of doing that with the Jerry Jazz pieces. But what I've begun to notice more recently is working with some of the folks I like working with, like a guy, my good buddy, Chris Broberg. He's a super talented musician I work with. And Noel Hay, I just began working with him. He's a saxophone and piano player. And what I did with Noel most recently is I sent him a piece of a poem I spoke, and I had him compose some music. And then when he sent the music back, I re-recorded the speaking of the poem using his music as a new way to calibrate it. And so there's a lot of creative ways I've found. I love working with music and writing more with the poetry. Um, and so, no, I wouldn't have music typically playing if I'm composing a short story, or even if writing typical poetry or revising. I kind of keep the try to keep a kind of more crystal clear environment of my brain.
definitely no music for Mr. Douglas. On
Or
character voice and language, how do you find or hear a distinct voice for a new narrator or protagonist? Is it sudden discovery or gradual tuning process?
oh, that's a Daniel, you got some good questions. I appreciate what you're asking me. You're coming at me. I like
You're
that.
most welcome.
Uh, Especially in this Invisible Hand, I've got three braided narratives, three different characters: Sarah, Gabriel, Jones. And what I began to realize more later in the revising stage is that the voice of the writing, even though it's third person, and each one has its own voice according to the character, a certain vocabulary I began to discover, and I tried to kind of refine it, but very lightly. I didn't want to be too heavy-handed about that, but I began to realize it was happening a lot more just through, allowing the intention rather than pushing the intention. And um and especially when I've been practicing to read it, especially for my reading last night at Elliott Bay Books, I can hear it more, that the narrator, the third person narrator, and I always thought, in my way of doing this particular third person narration, because my first novel, The White Field, was in the first person, and you have a lot more freedom. I feel like there's a lot more freedom in the first person. Just say whatever's in the head, because you're playing an act, you're playing a character, writing a character, writing the character you're playing in your mind. I am. And with the Invisible Hand, the same thing's happening, but I had these characters that are a little more not me. I can't really sit inside them in the same way as I would with a first person narration. But the third person kept this little remove, and I always was kind of prejudiced towards what I remember Hemingway, the early modernists, said about the third person, especially Hemingway, that it should be this more limited, over the shoulder third person. So you don't really have a lot of what characters are thinking. You're just observing like a camera. And I thought that seemed like a clean way to go. But in this one, I also drew from, I love another writer, Jim Harrison. I love Louise Erdrich too, that gives you more of the internal dialogues and even from the third person. So I kind of lightened my foot on the brakes with that, but mostly it's over the shoulder, limited third person. But the tone, the language, yeah, I did notice it changes because of the characters to be in sync in a way with the character, because they're different ages. Jones is an older man, and Sarah is a kind of 17, 18, 19-year-old young woman, and Gabriel's like a 8-year-old kid. So yeah, intuitively, and then later more consciously, I realized the narration's got to it's got to adjust per character. So I hope that answers your question. I think that's what you asked me.
Yes, definitely, Mr. Douglas. Yes, indeed. What is your
Uh,
process for developing complex characters? Do you use worksheets, interviews, or do they reveal themselves through the action and dialogue?
uh, Man, you're making me feel like I'm not working hard enough. The time
You're working
I'm
so
just like,
hard. You're
I
working
should
so
be
hard,
doing
Mr. Douglas.
Yeah, with the characters, it's always this really fun kind of alchemy, and I use that word lightly, alchemy, but also aware of drawing a little bit from my own memory. In fact, it's funny. I was thinking about this today for our conversation. That in the construction of the characters, I always like to kind of drop a little content of my own past, people I know, and I've sort of, I don't know if everyone will like it, but I've often had little bits of my friends and stuff that I will put into a character. I like it because I kind of want my friends to read it and go, "Hey, that's me," hopefully in a good way, and then they don't feel like, "How dare you?" But I try to be sensitive to people's reality, not tell anybody's story or anything like that. But I like to kind of put little energy nugget into a character, which will sometimes be a little memory or a little quality or a little something that comes from me or my friend or my family, people I know. And then that always gets mixed and added to with stuff I just make up, or things that I'm putting in there intentionally as references to other characters in literature. in order to kind of make that sort of allusion, literary allusion or reference to kind of sort of show the way in which there are little ties. I've got little ties to the, DNA chain of my own reading history, the writers that have kind of influenced and affected me. I kind of like to have just a little hint and weave of that into the characters too. So that's kind of the way I approach the construction of my characters if I approach it consciously.
That'd be awesome, Mr. Douglas. So, on revision and editorial mindset, what is your multi layered approach to revision? Do you separate passages for plot, character, prose, or line edits, or is it more holistic process?
Yeah. Well, and I tell my writing students this too, that generally I think it's best just get from beginning to end, get a full. It's much easier for me too to start an editing process if I feel like I've got a general whole construction and I'm not waiting, or there's going to be a missing piece I'm going to get stuck on later. um, Usually the revision process, what I do and what I recommend for students, I do the bigger changes, moving pieces around, like especially with the invisible hand, getting these different sections to work together and moving them in ways that would be nice and connective with the other stories and bounce off them and have hints of things like I was noticing in my reading last night. Certain characters are smoking cigarettes, which people don't do a lot. And there's these two characters, and so it ties them in. And two characters I may have mentioned on Wednesday too. They have mention of their fathers. The fathers are characters that are playing both absent and present, kind of odd, roles in their lives. And so in my revisions, I tend to stick to the global, to the bigger chunks first, and then I like to go through and once those are more or less in place, I do a real strict, and I get this term from Richard Hugo, crap detector. Put your crap detector on your head, look at it, and then go in line by line and make sure there's music, make sure the poetry is working, make sure it's not pretentious, make sure there's nothing clunky, make sure there's no, weird tongue twisters, make sure that nothing sounds pretentious. I get, and I just continue to dial up the intensity on that scrutiny. And that's my process.
It's the process indeed, Mr. Douglas.
Yeah.
And how do you massage creative energy and avoid burnout across long projects? Do you write every day or focus bursts with breaks in between?
Well, like I said, when I was writing my first book, I learned the hard lesson. If you just stick there, and I stick there for 8 hours in a chair trying to plow my way through something, it's going to hurt my body. I've gotten much better as I've gotten older in balancing my life and keeping my body healthy and my mind, as active and healthy, so that, yeah, I enjoy doing it because I actually find that the work is more energizing than it is draining. It's a lot of fun. In fact, I was thinking about, the way in which the actual process of writing is a practice of your transcendental brain. It's a way of working your enlightenment muscle, because you're conscious of creating and being in the process of creating, and you yourself as a creator of something, and you're creating this thing, and the thing is usually tuned into some sort of themes of, truth and beauty and what our human experience means in a bigger picture, what that bigger picture might be. And so I find it much more invigorating, and any kind of burnout would be my own, fault if I didn't properly balance my life with good food. Like you tell me, good food, you got to eat decent food. I keep telling my kids, if you're going to go into debt on anything, buy good food and
Buy
exercise.
good
Yes.
food.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Take care of your
So,
body.
yes, Mr. Douglas, to wrap up our discussion for today, looking back, what was been a single most valuable lesson about writing process that you had to learn the hard way?
Mm, yeah, I can't really emphasize enough just the integrated physical, emotional, you know, creative energy we are. For me, yeah, I learned. Serious. I mean, I've helped build houses. I've been. You know, I'm a pretty physical person, but just if you just sit, right. That's almost worse on the body than trying to pick up an oversized boulder. So the best lesson I've learned is you got to take care of the holistic experience, your whole body, and people too, right? I think of Ikkyu, I mentioned him before, maybe Crazy Cloud, 12th century Zen poet, and his version of enlightenment said that you can't do it in a sense. You can't go up to the mountains to find, and true enlightenment is happening in every day, in your relationships with people, as complicated as they are, and in the world that you're actually a part of.
Indeed, Mr. Douglas, thank you for sharing your writing process to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to write all your books? So, where do people can buy your books, Mr. Douglas?
They can get my books at secropress.com or finishingline.com or unsolicitedpress.com. Basically, you can go to Amazon. You can go to my website, douglasTcole.com, and I've got all the books listed there with links to buy them.
Yes, people, where books are sold, let's support Mr. Douglas, because if you support him, for sure more and more empowering and award-winning piece will come. So, Mr. Douglas, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, I appreciate it, Daniel. Thank you for having me on.
Monica, people, see you soon.